the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and we will analyse geopolitics today and how, in specific terms, how the global order is changing fast after the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. Today, in particular, Paul and I will examine how the United States military arm is now pivoting to the Indo-Pacific region as the People's Republic of China itself pivots its priorities westward to a land-based Silk Road orientation. It joins in that respect Pakistan, Russia, Iran to develop interests in the post-US Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. It appears both the United States and China are moving in a way to fill the perceived vacuum left by each other side. Also, significantly, the United States and Australia have announced overnight the nuclearisation of Australia's submarine fleet, and missile testing has fired into gear on the Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, the PRC admitted this week in Seoul that North Korea is difficult to influence. Strategically, China has focused its attention to Silk Road interests. It also is preoccupied inwardly. China has issues at home, as does the United States, where President Joe Biden is struggling to stabilise entrenched divisions in the post-Trump period. But back to China. China, where its leader Xi Jinping has ordered strict screen time controls over new generation Chinese. He's also ordered huge regulatory reforms designed to control its wealth-generating business sector, and also to a command for China's wealthy classes to shift towards statewide goal of common prosperity. So what does all this mean for the states and economies of the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region? So to unpack all of this, let's cross to Paul and get into this geopolitical complexity. Good afternoon, Paul. Tēnā koe, mātua.
Yeah, Tēnā koe, Selwyn, and good afternoon to all our listeners around the world. Hope everybody is doing well in these pandemic times.
Absolutely, and we're coming to you from a tempestuous pre-equinox Auckland, New Zealand, where I'm wrapped up anyway. Paul isn't so much, but I'm wrapped up to keep warm through the episode. So let's get to it, Paul. Let's just cross to this and let's open up one of the main events that happened overnight. And this, of course, is the United States and Australian-led announcement. Let's let it play in here. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia.
Today, we join our nations in a next-generation partnership built on a strong foundation of proven trust. We have always seen the world through a similar lens. We have always believed in a world that favours freedom, that respects human dignity, the rule of law, the independence of sovereign states and the peaceful fellowship of nations. And while we have always looked to each other to do what we believe is right, we have never left at each other. Always together, never alone.
So, Paul, there's a big announcement about the United States, the UK and Australia forward committing basically to security interests and announcing a very strong and united pact there. It also elevates, doesn't it, the Australian effort into a bit more than the United States' deputy sheriff on the Asia-Pacific bloc, but something of global significance. But anyway, I'll leave your voice of reason and expertise to unpack that for us. What do you make of all of this, Paul?
Well, you certainly laid out a topical buffet for our audience today. Where to begin? Okay, so let's start with the fact that it's not coincidental that we have this announcement today after the precipitous retreat from Afghanistan by the United States and some of its allies, not all of its allies, but some of them decided to go along with the U.S. And it left the U.S. embarrassed, humiliated, And again, there was planning involved, but it wasn't good enough, etc. But this announcement has been in the works for a very long time. And so they may have moved up the date of the announcement, but it follows, of course, the creation of what is known as the Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, in a security alliance that's focused on the Indian Ocean, interestingly enough. This is a complement to that. And the evolution of Australia from the deputy sheriff in the South Hemisphere to what will eventually become the U.S.'s greatest security partner, because that's where they're headed. And there is a cross-party consensus in Australia, with the exception of the Greens and some fringe leftist parties, that the People's Republic of China is their greatest strategic threat. Be it the Labour Party, be it the Liberal Party, clearly the elites all agree on this. And they've been having trouble with regards to the nuclear fleet. This has been in discussion for a long time. There have been many white papers issued, and they've been having trouble getting advanced diesel-powered submarines into the works. French models mostly. They considered German models. The Australians even considered an indigenous capability, and there was some talk about having the French come down and develop a submarine building capability in
South Australia, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think what happened is the U.S. preempted it all and said, look, we trust you guys so much. And the U.K. is no longer the power it was, but it's also up in the Northern Hemisphere where we can deal with our interests with them. How about you join us as full partners in the nuclear realm? And submarines are such a versatile platform. I mean, they do so many things, and we'll see what type of submarines they bring. I haven't seen the details of this news, but it's one thing to be nuclear powered. Let's say like an Ohio class or an LA class attack submarine. They don't necessarily carry nukes on board. It's another thing to be what they call a boomer, that is a submarine dedicated to launching sea-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, which are basically the same as intercontinental ballistic missiles, except they're hidden underwater. Now, that is a capability that very few countries have. As in
Paul, you've described here, perhaps, if I put it this way, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's potential for mission creep of the nuclearization from a weapons point of view in the Australasian region.
Yes, I would imagine that right now what we're talking about is nuclear propulsion, and not necessarily installing SLBMs on them. I mean, they'll have cruise missiles. They'll be state-of-the-art, clearly. But, that will be a serious ratcheting up should the Australians acquire the ability to launch SLBMs. And the Chinese obviously will not be happy about this announcement. They will be extremely unhappy if the Australians acquire a nuclear missile capability. So watch this space. But here's the thing that's interesting about this is that the Obama administration talked about a pivot to Asia and then didn't do a lot because it had other fish to fry. It did move 60% of its naval assets into the Pacific, away from the Atlantic, simply reflecting a shift in strategic priorities. This is now fully committing to prioritizing the Western Pacific as the next potential conflict scenario. And I should point out that the U.S. is considering resurrecting the Second Fleet. The Second Fleet was disbanded in 1970. It was put into mothballs. They're thinking of resurrecting it, which means a carrier group and everything that goes with it, and either forward porting it in Darwin or perhaps the Solomon Islands. It really depends on whether or not they want to defend the maritime lanes of communication between Asia and the South Pacific, Australia, one and Antarctica beyond, or are they more oriented towards the Indian Ocean and they want to cut off the straits between the Pacific? And there's three major straits between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. Certainly putting a carrier group in the middle of that will deter any Chinese ambitions to move ships quickly. So the U.S. has not only committed to putting assets on the ground throughout the Western Pacific. Remember, there's a Marine Expeditionary Force already forward based in Darwin. That's 5,000 Marines ready to go. So it wouldn't take a lot to expand the port facilities and whatnot into a full-fledged naval station. The point is the U.S. has decided with the retreat from Afghanistan that its best interest is served by marshaling its military resources in the maritime space in the Western Pacific. And the Chinese are going to have to deal with that, because what that means is it raises the costs to China to project its interests into the South Pacific exponentially, particularly given that China, for the first time, is now going to look landwards towards its, what is it? Its its western flank, into Central Asia in order to protect the commercial interests that inevitably are going to accrue as a result of China's recognition of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The Taliban
Now, on that
have said
point,
that China is their best international partner. Well, there'll be costs as well as benefits associated with that partnership.
So what we're talking about for the audience's benefit here too is in a grand scale, we're seeing an oscillation arguably that is occurring here. We're seeing the United States moving out of its interests up there in Afghanistan, but even regionally up there, and shifting down into the Pacific, but significantly the Western Pacific, Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region, the western areas of that. It's a move, obviously, that the United States is designing to and confront or control or contain China in some ways. At the same time, it seems that for some years, really, in a sense, China has not been in an expansion kind of move into the islands of the Pacific. It's kind of just marked time in a sense. It's moving both its gaze and its scope inward homeland, and also, as Paul is identifying here, much more emphasis relating westward from the China point of view into the areas of the Silk Road and opening up those markets. Belt and Road, in some way, some of the analysis that's coming out of the economic sector since about November last year is saying the economics of China is not able to sustain its ambitions going back that were marked out perhaps 3 years ago. So that's something that is in play at the same time. But that's some of the backstory, isn't it, Paul? What we're seeing too is China actually conceding, for example, and we'll just bring this up on screen, conceding in a sense that North Korea, the big problem in the on the Korean Peninsula from the point of view of security and stabilization, some would say, well, it's a response to being contained. But in the missile testing that went on this week, it doesn't happen by chance. And I'll just bring up perhaps right at this point CBS just to illustrate what's going on. There's about a 60 to 70 second rundown by CBS's people on the ground.
Says it launched 2 ballistic missiles into the sea just days. Ramy, thank you.
Oops, I've gone a bit too far.
Ballistic missiles today are a breach of UN resolutions, unlike the 2 new cruise missiles that the country fired over the weekend. The ones today arced nearly 40 miles above the Earth and flew about 500 miles east before landing in the Sea of Japan. That's also known as the East Sea, and that's according to South Korea's military. Pyongyang often fires off missiles when its leaders want to show their anger about something happening in the region, and they were likely watching talks in Tokyo today about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Special envoys from the United States, Japan, and South Korea all met today. And, when someone's talking about you and you're not at the table, you're probably not going to be very happy about that either. On top of that, China's Foreign Ministry Wang Yi was in Seoul. Beijing has indicated that it's become harder and harder to rein in North Korea. China is the North's last biggest ally in the world.
So, Paul, that's CBS's coverage, of course, but that is an interesting point, isn't it, that China making that note relating to North Korea. It's almost like it's found a strategic position to perhaps allow some room there for the Western aligned nations to become more aggressive in its diplomacy and its response to North Korea's testing of these missiles this week.
Yeah, I mean, what that was basically is China telling the North Koreans that their security guarantee to North Korea is not set in concrete. That the Koreans have to, behave as responsible allies, or that security guarantee could be withdrawn in part or in whole. And the last thing China needs now, with its ambitions in Central Asia, trying to defend its ambitions in the Western Pacific, is for the North Koreans to stir up trouble. And that's exactly what they're doing. Again, the cruise missiles weren't the issue, but you're now, showing that you've got, intercontinental ballistic missile launchers that are clearly functional. They clearly work. So
can you explain for the audience the difference between the two, Paul? It's significant, isn't it?
Yeah. So, there's many type of missiles. Let's separate the boosters, that is the rocket that goes, from the warhead. The warhead is where the nukes are. And they can be single shot, although those days are long over, or they can be what are known as MIRVed, that is multiple independent reentry vehicles. So you can put 14 nuclear warheads on the top in the nose cone of a booster. And the more advanced ones are known as MARV, maneuverable reentry vehicles, so you can guide them down. Unlike a dumb bomb, you can actually steer them via cameras straight to the target. And we're talking nuclear weapons here. The Chinese have shown, the North Koreans have shown that they now have the ability to boost such packages far offshore, i.e. the mainland United States, because they're signaling to the states, we can reach you now, not just California, we can reach into your homeland. And, that's a strategic problem for U.S. military planners, but it's also a tremendous military and diplomatic problem for the Chinese, because they don't want the North Koreans put back in the U.S. into a corner when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons. The Chinese have no interest in a major nuclear exchange between the U.S. and its allies and North Korea. And that's the thing. I think the Chinese are saying to the North Koreans, you want to dial it back a little bit, because we're not entirely sure that we're going to come to your defense if you provoke something so outrageous that the response is justified. And again, the Chinese are about to embark on something extremely ambitious. Chinese defenders, including here in the West, will tell you that they've never launched an aggressive war of opportunity against their neighbors and against others, that all their military is defensively configured. Well, the Vietnamese may have something to say about that. But the fact is that they haven't been tested as a land-based military. They have a 1 million-man army, but it's never been tested in battle. The push out into the Pacific has certainly given experience to their naval assets. Their maritime capabilities have improved exponentially. They're going to have 4 carriers within the next 10 years, whereas right now they only have 1, and that's basically a prototype. The fact is they're about to move into Central Asia, not as an expeditionary force or an invading force, but here's the deal. The United States quit in part because it realized that after 20 years, even though it's a great military power, it cannot sustain endless, irregular warfare against unconventional tribal militias and fighters. There's nothing there that justifies that ongoing drain of blood and treasure. So they quit. They left. And they left because they want to do something else with their military. The Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and the Pakistanis, as you well mentioned, are now about to find out what is involved in trying to, quote unquote, pacify a country like Afghanistan in order to reap material benefits from it. They want to get into the mining sector and those sort of things. Now, let's be very clear. They may be all united in the sense that they believe that the West, is a common foe. They may be united in that they believe that they have a better plan for Afghanistan. But the specific interests of Russians, Pakistanis, Iranians, and Chinese are not coterminous. They're not reading off the same sheet of music here.
We're talking common ground possibility, and you're saying, well, that's a difficult one to actually achieve. Yeah.
Well, under stress. Think about it. Right now, everything's harmonious. And as I said before, The Taliban have said that their foremost international interlocutor is China. So they're like, being real friendly with the Chinese. The trouble is, what happens when that marriage of convenience of interested foreign parties starts being put under stress because, let's say, some rogue militia decides to kill a few Chinese mining engineers, in some godforsaken province? That'll be the test. That's where we'll see their mettle. Yeah. And I think that the Chinese can ill afford to have the North Koreans starting up trouble because, and here I'll finish with this for the time being, even though you can't translate maritime assets into land-based assets, the resource drain of focusing now on two fronts, that is your land borders and beyond into Central Asia, that you may have to militarily defend should your interests come under siege, and your interests are expanding as a result of the Belt and Road being superimposed on the Silk Road, because that's exactly where they're going with this. There will be a diversion of resources from the Western Pacific by the Chinese. That's exactly what the United States and its allies are seeking to exploit. You mentioned the oscillation, and I always think of a metronome, back and forth, the pendulum. Well, the U.S. left a vacuum in Central Asia, and the Chinese and its partners said, thank you very much, we'll pick it up from here. But in doing so, they're, if not leaving a vacuum, they're leaving space for the anti-China coalition to increase its assets and capabilities, and that's exactly what the announcement today is all about.
Yeah, thank you for that analysis there, Paul. So why would China, for example, right now risk all of this and change its positions, its priorities, its strategic advantageous manoeuvrings, if you put it? What makes it an advantage? If we just look at internally, for example, there's the announcement from Xi Jinping, the leader of China, where the PRC is moving toward common prosperity. And that's, if we look back, it's a concept that was initiated by Mao. Didn't fall out of favour, but it was put on the back burner by Deng Xiaoping. From the point of view of allowing, what was it, the saying at that time, Paul? If you allow the tide to rise, all the boats will go up with it. It was along the lines of that, meaning in Western things we would say, oh, well, it's the opposite of a trickle-down kind of idea that the Chinese were pushing there. But this return with Xi Jinping going back to common prosperity, we've seen it from the point of view of, over the last few months, for example, the strong regulatory announcements coming out of the People's Republic of China relating to its income earning, its economic super engines, if you like, that they are strongly have become regulated in that sense. The call to China's wealthy upper class, and I'll just point out, for example, Western analysis, and I'll just underline that, Western analysis. For example, Bloomberg has been reporting this week that China's richest 20% earn more than 10 times the poorest 20. So if people who have got an idea of shaping that into a visual, that shows a definite, very wide gap. And obviously, for the aspirations and stability of China, mainland China, Xi Jinping is thinking, you can see his thinking is saying, well, let's actually explore perhaps markets being able to sustain China's growth to get toward common prosperity. But that's the goal, that's what they're moving at, and that's what they're really going for. And I think if you put it into the context, perhaps that's why China is risking creating perhaps a window of opportunity, strategically allowing the Western nations to up their presence in the the Indo-Pacific region in that respect. But getting back to you, Paul, let's unpick, for example, what is happening from the point of view of the Western nations and what they would hope to achieve here in real terms. And if you look and cast your eye out perhaps in the next 12 months, what do you foresee and predict the shape of what is going to happen with respect to the West, the impact on the Southeast Asian economies, the ASEAN economies of the region?
Before I do so, let me just point out, I'm not I'm not a sinologist, so my expertise with regards to China is pretty limited. But let me just say this: it's very clear that Xi Jinping understands a version of modernization theory, and you mentioned it: a rising tide raises all boats. He needs to continue the economic expansion in order to continue to build his middle class. His middle class will have a vested interest in his regime. That is, more people enjoying the benefits of a booming economy that they owe to him. And that's, one of the institutional aspects of China these days, is that much like the Republican Party in the States has become the party of Donald Trump, the Chinese Communist Party has become the party of Xi Jinping, for better or for worse. And he has tremendous global ambitions. So what he's doing, and by the way, even though China has an expanding middle class and has enjoyed tremendous economic growth over the last 30 years, 60% of the Chinese still live below the poverty line, according to the World Bank. So, it is still in the process of modernizing, and those income inequalities that you mentioned are very typical of countries that are modernizing and are in the process of becoming what you'd call middle powers, medium powers. Now, China is much more than that, so its problems in developing its middle class are much more than that. And you mentioned, so we know why he's doing it. The structural reason is to get more and more people to benefit, but China's got to expand outwards, economically speaking, in order for that to happen. So what does he do? That's where the economy is interconnected with society and social mores. He's got to get the wealth to share some of their wealth with less fortunate compatriots. And, that's a cultural thing. That's a sociological thing. But she is looking across at the United States, and he's seeing the divisive effect of social media on the U.S. narrative. And when I say U.S. narrative, not just its political narrative, everything, its cultural narrative, it's broken apart. Unlike the United States, he doesn't run a democracy. He can shut things down in a hurry if things get too divisive. And there's a generational divide now in China where younger people may not be as patriotic, are much more outward looking than their parents were. I mean, they take their cultural cues from other places. Let's say, just to be silly, what are those K-pop boys? The silly little boy bands. They're not Chinese. Okay, no. They're Korean. So he's got problems, and he looks over at the U.S. and he looks over and he says, that's a paper tiger. Not only because it couldn't even finish off Afghanistan as a nation-building / pacification process, but it's culturally corroded from within because it allowed all of these pernicious influences, this rot, to set deeply thanks in part to social media. So what does Xi Jinping think? I'm cutting that off right at the bud. We're going to stop this right now. I'm going to ask the rich to pay a little more of their fair share of the freight. But most importantly, I am going to revamp our cultural mores under CCP direction so that the youth understand that they may have to sacrifice in order to achieve this common dream of prosperity and benefits for all. And that in turn includes a large standing military ready to defend that outward economic expansion at all costs. Remember 2 weeks ago, they decided to remove effeminate men from state media. There was this whole thing about sissy boys and what have you. Obviously someone, I would say probably she, has issues with effeminate men. I'll leave it at that. But he, because he's an authoritarian, he was able to come out and say, remove these type of people from the media screens of the People's Republic. Let's remove, these are bad role models. And you and I in the West can go, come on, that's, you're jumping the shark here. Yeah. It shows his mindset, okay? It shows he wants burly men. He wants to project this type of strength. He wants his youth to be these type of guys because,
And this is projecting to his own homeland. It's not projecting necessarily outward, is it?
It doesn't do anything for us.
No.
I mean, again, and many of our militaries have gays in the military, and we don't bat an eye, because they do the job. They do what they got to do. They can fight just as any hetero can. So in the West, we don't really, whatever. For the Chinese, they haven't reached that point yet. All right. Again, there's cultural issues involved and whatnot. It's not for me to judge right and wrong. What I'm saying is he's got a project that involves redefining masculinity around something tough.
Well, I'd say redefining the Chinese identity in some ways. When you've got a country that is so large, is so complex, its footprint even geographically is huge, its economy is absolutely huge on a global scale. So the solutions to the perceived problems of sustaining or growing the abilities or meeting the wants of other classes, and remember, this is a communist state, those other classes that may feel alienated from the economic gains that 20% of the country have been enjoying in spades. So the solutions to that, they're huge, aren't they? And it seems like what we're seeing we're starting to witness those huge solutions as perceived by the CCP leadership.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's got to start with the Han population and gain their complete loyalty, and then start moving on to various minorities. And remember, this is a country of 1 billion people. The Communist Chinese Party has 70 million members. That's a fraction of the total population, and they have benefited disproportionately. But so his problems are big league problems, to be sure. Now, what the West is trying to do is simply just raise the costs of that ambitious, if not superpower, great power project. And so what you do is you make the costs of the Chinese presence in the Western Pacific, to include the South China Sea, but certainly the Sea of Japan / East Sea, just raise those costs. And so you asked me earlier, what is the West's response? Well, let's look at it. It's U.S.-led, but we now have the U.S. signing bilateral and multilateral defense agreements with countries as disparate as Singapore, again, the Quad countries, now the Tri countries, and there are other pre-existing arrangements. It's renewing its security relationship with the Philippines, because although Rodrigo Duterte tried to make nice with the Chinese, they repaid the favor by sending their fishing fleet into his territorial waters with impunity. So he got burned. He's now rediscovering that Americans aren't all bad, especially when it comes to parking their boats offshore. And then again, there's the ongoing relationship between the United States and Brunei, the United States and Malaysia, and Indonesia has now come into the fold, not fully, but the Indonesians have signed an agreement to regularly engage in military exercises with the Australians, their traditional nemesis.
Yeah, this is a big deal, this is, because the Australian military apparatus always has shaped itself from a response combat point of view with Indonesia in mind, yeah?
And vice versa. I mean,
vice versa.
And so you're absolutely right. I mean, these two countries, traditional adversaries looking across each other across the straits, are now looking jointly at the Chinese as the common threat. All diplomatic necessities aside. So
just on, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so let's unpack exactly what the West countries, particularly Australia, the United States, and Britain, in this respect, risk. And I'll just, from a long-term point of view, and I might even focus down, if we can, further into Australia. I'll just take a quick transition break and come back on that. Now, Paul, what we've got here is news that has broken through PBS in the United States earlier this week, and it's regarding the nuclear codes mainly, but also it gives an idea and an understanding of what happens behind the headlines when you've got a rogue president like Donald Trump at a point where the military brass detect that he has crossed the line into instability zone. Let's put it kindly like that. And what they do. And what we're seeing here is reportage coming out of the United States, but particularly PBS, where it is identifying through multiple sources. This isn't just one source it's talking about, but unrelated sources like 5 different. So it's getting some traction over there, that the military brass engaged with the Chinese in the last days of the Trump administration and saying, you will not have a nuclear threat from the United States during this transition to the new president. It's an interesting little thing, Paul. Before we get into the risks, you can see where I'm going with this, is that I'll just play this for the audience's benefit.
Revelations tonight about how concerned the nation's top military officer was about former President Donald Trump's behavior and actions around last year's election and the January insurrection. They come from a yet-to-be-released book by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa of The Washington Post, and they raise serious questions about the end of the Trump administration, the perception of the former president's fitness for the job, and civil-military relations. Here to explore all of this are White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and Foreign Affairs and Defense correspondent Nick Schifrin. So, Nick, to you first, what steps have you learned that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, took around the time of the election?
In January, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, called his counterpart, General Zhuo Cheng. That's a photo of the two of them there, actually taken years before in Beijing. And what I'm about to report, Judy, is all from a defense official, 3 former senior defense officials, a former senior Trump administration official, and a senior congressional official. At the time, Milley was extremely concerned about what President Trump was capable of. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper had been terminated. The January 6th attack had just occurred, and senior Pentagon officials had been replaced with Trump loyalists. And so Milley talked every day with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. They worked together to try and ensure there was continuity right at the end of the Trump administration, ensure there was no surprises on national security. And part of that was reassuring adversaries that there was going to be continuity from Trump to Biden.
So, Paul, that's it in a nutshell, in a sense, but also the issue of the nuclear codes came through as well in that discussion, that news break. Also, I'll just bring up, for example, what is Craig Burns is just citing Australian media here, and Craig Burns is based over in Australia. He's saying in Australian media, it's reported that submarines will be based in Perth at HMS Sterling. Also, US nuclear submarines will be based there, and that's what's coming through from Australia with respect to what's being reported there from with this announcement that Australia and the United States and the UK, and Australia in particular, will see a nuclearisation, at least in the propulsion areas of its military submarine fleets. Now, clearly what I'm kind of packaging here, Paul, is the element of concerns if we're pushing out in the next number of years from the point of view of assurities back in the United States can no longer be kind of relied upon, that it's going to have sane and stable leadership in the White House. And in that kind of consideration, what kind of risks are there for countries that may join this type of arrangement that the United States Joe Biden administration is pushing out into the Western Pacific, Indo-Pacific region?
Well, to Craig's comment, I'll point out that's a natural place for the submarine fleet to be based because, again, if it's true that the U.S. Second Fleet's going to wind there, the infrastructure improvements needed to expand the facilities in Darwin are not as great as, for example, if you're going to try to put a large naval presence in Cairns. There's been talk about Perth as well. But of all the likely candidates, they're going to have to be far north, given the strategic concerns. And Darwin is the most ideally suited at present, given the infrastructure it has already. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. Not at all. Now,
so what you're saying there is you would identify most likely up in Darwin and probably also Perth for strategic regions from the point of view of response.
Yeah. I mean, there is discussion. Again, getting back to our original segment, there's discussion of the Australians and the Americans using the Solomon Island port of Tulagi, an old World War II port that is now, they're expanding the runway from 6,000 feet to 14,000 feet. The Chinese, what sparked their interest was the Chinese try to get a lease on the entire island of Tulagi. And that really concerned strategic planners, so they convinced the Solomons government to instead lease out the airport and port facilities on that island. And there's some talk that that second fleet may wind up there.
And from a strategic point of view, though, the United States audience might actually recognise some of that from the point of view of World War II and how strategically important it was for Western allies to take the Solomon Islands area of Guadalcanal and the battles that ensued around that area. Is that correct? So I just wanted to put that in for context for those that are further abroad from this region.
Yeah, no, good point, because, for us here, we can see the strategic importance of the Solomon Islands to north-south maritime trade, to the sea lanes up and down there. The Japanese, of course, understood that as well. So there is talk about Tulagi, and we have to remember, the Chinese have signed a lease and are developing an airport, again, from 6,000 feet to 10,000 feet runways in Kiribati on the island of Canton, which is even further into the Pacific Ocean. And that has strategic planners in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, extremely concerned that they're going to put a forward naval presence in one of these places. And that'll make it a lot harder to fend off, let's say, for example, Chinese attack submarines. Again, submarines are high value for what they can do to surface fleets. And shore installations for that matter. So we're full on. The game is full on. And I agree that the reports Craig is reading are more than likely true, that the new submarine fleet will be based in Darwin. But that's not the only place they could be based, and that includes further afield. Now, getting into what we just saw with Miley and what have you. Well, the good news, Selwyn, is you and I have talked about the command and control structure surrounding nuclear weapons in the United States. And we've said, look, the military, the Joint Staff will more than likely not allow some crazy president to start trying to launch nukes in order to stage a diversion or, in this case, somehow steal an election and that sort of thing. That there's enough, how could I put it, checks and balances within the military command and control structure on nuclear weapons to prevent the president from going off the reservation and doing such a thing. However, this conversation, let's be very clear, Miley did not call the Russians. He didn't get a hold of Vladimir Putin. Why? Because Vladimir Putin and Russia were never going to get nuked if Donald Trump went nuts. Donald Trump views Putin as a friend. So he went to the likely adversary, which Trump had ramped up the hostilities with, and said to them, rest assured, in our battle plans, we have no battle plan to attack you first, regardless of what this president may say. And you understand the situation. He just lost an election. He's just encouraged an insurrection. He's grasping at straws. So please, even if you see rumblings from our side of the ocean, ignore them or get on the phone. That's the key thing. You see a hot flash coming out of South Dakota. That could be a missile coming out of a silo. Get on the phone. All right? We have self-destruct buttons that we can take those missiles out well before they get to you. But do not misconstrue something going on in the United States for an attack on your homeland. Don't do it.
And what was interesting in that point too is there was a couple of one surprise in the sense that, so you got your top military representative that is interfacing with the President of the United States, that he went to his top military people with respect to the nuclear areas and the sequence. I was surprised from this point of view that in a natural command situation, the president can circumnavigate or can leapfrog that significant military advisor in the White House, the top guy, if you want to put it that way, and go directly to those and command a nuclear strike. And what we saw with Miley there is he went to his top nuclear officers and he said, I will be read in on every communication coming out of the president's office, that I will be it was there by convention, but he was assuring himself and obviously then assuring those further afield, like what you're saying here with the People's Republic of China's leadership, that he will not allow a nuclear strike to occur on the basis of a crazy president, putting it in very obviously crude and colloquial terms. And that sequence seemed to be where the debate in the United States went yesterday from the point of view of, was he entitled to do that? And then the counter-argument was, well, you've got a crazy president under these extreme situations where it was clearly defined as not being stable anymore and his decision-making erratic at best. Then he was serving not just the United States' interests, but the global interest in this regard.
Yeah, look, we've said this before. Someone's going to write a book down the road in which we're going to realize how close we came to disaster with Trump. We've scratched the surface of the insanity that was that administration. And the fact, there's good news and bad news, the fact that he had to call together his nuclear commanders from all three forces, all the major forces, and say, let's sit down and remember your constitutional obligations. You remember your checks and balances. See, there was a concern that there might be some rogue sort of middle-ranking officers that had their hands on nuclear weapons, who at the command of the president, them being MAGA types, might, again, go off the reservation with Trump and launch strikes for whatever purpose. I would hope that that would never occur, that the people who are actually sitting in the silos, sitting in airplanes, waiting to go, sitting in submarines, that their sense of responsibility and their full knowledge of what happens when nukes go off would deter them from following the capricious and, quite frankly, illegal orders of a president who's just trying to defend the possibility that he could somehow regain the election. Now, what's amazing is Republicans and right-wing media in the States say what Miley did was treasonous, forgetting conveniently that what Trump has done with Putin might be called treasonous as well. What Miley did was, besides avert, if not a major nuclear war, avert the tensions that, build up to it, that was a professional courtesy. He called the commander of the U.S.'s greatest adversary, military adversary, and said, hey, I'm giving you a heads up. All is not what it seems with Trump. And so I'm extending you the courtesy. I don't want you to get nervous. Our nuclear forces, remember, we've talked about this. They're second strike. They're not designed to first strike. We know that we can't kill all of the Chinese nuclear weapons in one fell swoop, so something's coming back, right? It's the return to sender problem. And so he's just getting on the horn and saying, this is my courtesy to you. And I'm sure that the Chinese general appreciated the heads up, because he's got some hot-headed commanders himself, who are interested in making a name for themselves. So I look at this, I'm not a big fan of Miley for many reasons, but in this one he did right. And the major concern to me was that he actually had to call a meeting of his nuclear commanders to remind them of their obligations at such a fraught time.
Well, the reasons that coming out of his camp is because the Trump administration had put in its own biased toads, if you like, into the Pentagon decision-making chain. So it was not the independent, perhaps non-partisan groupings of military that would be assisting decisions in that particular area and reading to a sane president what the consequences may be for the United States and the globe. So it's an interesting kind of thing there, of the breaking down of the elements of democracy that have functioned perhaps arguably for many decades, and even in a small way with the United States, even in New Zealand, from the point of view of the public service. We know that the National Party, when it was in government, was pushing the public service advisories aside, appointing its own people that had National Party interests and perhaps culture to advise them on the consequences of decision makings. So, even at small kind of policy levels, we see this kind of thing happen. It's not obviously just the Republicans in the United States when they're in power that do such things, but the stakes are much higher, aren't they? So
my word.
When you get back to this, you, Paul, yourself and many analysts around the world, thousands of analysts around the world, have observed the instability of the United States. Even last week, we were talking in this episode, last week's episode of this program, about the folly of relying medium and long term on the United States while it is so divided internally and domestically with respect to security decision making. How do you read the Australian move and agreement today in that context, Paul?
Well, the Australian move, I think, from their point of view, is long term in nature. What you're seeing now is the Australians trying to claim a status in the Southern Hemisphere that even they haven't had before. And again, a status on world affairs, because if they become the U.S. foremost military ally, replacing the U.K., they're going to be the benefits of a lot of U.S. largesse, but they will be the object of the ire of U.S. adversaries, and justifiably so. But I think the important thing here is, if I was an advisor, let's say to the New Zealand government or the Australians, since we're talking about them, I'd say, okay, let's divide the short term from the long term. We're not going to be sure that the United States is going to stabilize for at least 4 to 6 years. We need to get through the midterm elections in 2022. We need to see who gets elected president in 2024. We need to see if Trump fades from the scene, if there'll be another insurrection, which is very possible. In fact, what is it, September, sometime right about now, on Saturday, there's supposedly going to be a big demonstration outside of Congress in support of the January 6th insurrectionists run by MAGA types. So if I was, a policy advisor to, the big guns in various capitals, I'd say, look, we've got a plan over the short term for the U.S. not being too reliable and actually being quite shaky. And that needs to be understood. Let's not commit ourselves to, let's say, a hot conflict in the short term if the United States comes and asks us to join some coalition of the willing. Over the long term, though, we can believe in long cycles. And all of this ruction that we're seeing now will eventually shake out. It may not shake out for the better. I mean, the U.S. could become an authoritarian state. It's even possible it could have a civil war and divide into two countries. Although it sounds crazy, you would have to hope that in both camps there are people who can control nukes with some degree of sanity. But it's simply too uncertain to try to predict what the United States is going to look like in 10 years. So you do what is called strategic hedging. You stay friendly, you stay helpful, but you don't do larger commitments. The exception being the Australians, because their long-term ambitions transcend any short-term hiccups. I mean, Australia truly wants to be a great power, out of proportion to its population size, and as remote as it may be from some major centers of conflict down the road. So I'd say, look, over the next 2 years, especially between now and November of 2020, wait and see, because I think a lot of craziness is going to happen. After that, let's say if the Republican Party loses in 2020 and then loses the presidency in 2024, that may be the end of Trumpism in the Republican Party, and they'll move in a different direction. The knives won't come out until he's well and fully dead. It'll be a little late, but they'll carve him up after his political demise. He's nowhere close to leaving the scene as we speak. So, as a strategic planner, you say, okay, this place is not a stable ally at this point. We have long-term commitments, and there again, the military and intelligence people are more reliable. There's more continuity. They know the stakes. And so let's just work with our counterparts, in defense, in the intelligence community, because we all agree on one thing. The major threat to Australia, some might argue New Zealand, but certainly the United States, at least when it comes to the security arena, is the People's Republic of China. And under President Xi, unfortunately, the Chinese have become much more aggressive, much more assertive. For better or for worse, they have great ambitions too. And the trouble is, their ambitions run into the interests of the United States and its partners, and that source of friction can ignite a larger conflict, and then the prospect of nukes actually comes to the table.
Yeah, and that's a dire warning for all. We've got quite a conversation that is taking place on Facebook where this episode, as always, live streams and is there on demand as well. I encourage the audience, if they so wish to join that conversation. There's some interesting stuff that has been placed in there by Liz Hughes. She does raise one issue with respect to comments that we made, Paul, with the Chinese people having been lived out of extreme poverty. She's citing the World Bank there of saying that more than 850 million Chinese people have been lifted out of, in what is termed here, extreme poverty. I think, the problems there are in the definitions of what are being used, Liz, and I'd just draw in my references here that what was being raised as the comparisons was China's richest 20% earn more than 10 times the poorest 20%, a wider gap than in the United States or European countries such as Germany and France, and one that has been but has not budged since 2015. And that was the premise and where we're coming from that point of view. But thank you for the comments. From Liz's contribution there is a citation and also a link for people to have a read and to make up their own minds on that. But do take the debate further. On that point, Paul, thank you very much for your contributions today, as always, and your company as well. And we look forward to bringing another episode of A View from Afar this time next week. So that is midday New Zealand time on a Thursday. In the United States, of course, that is a Wednesday, and around on the Eastern Daylight Saving Time band around 8 p.m. Until that time, thank you for your attendance. Thank you for showing interest in the program. And we'll see you next week. Take care.